Welcome back to the M&M Discipleship Podcast, where we discuss what it means to be a disciple of Christ. We aim to look for God in our daily lives, be in His Word, and strive to live out the teachings of Jesus. My name is Dakota Moody, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Michael Round. Michael, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, man. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. My wife is out of town because she has to do some training for work. So she is in Charlotte this week, and it's always one of those things where whenever my wife goes out of town, I get the slight bit of like, freedom, and then I'm like, there's a reason why I'm glad I don't have this freedom anymore. Because
Yeah.
I'm up at 10:15 at night eating half a sleeve of mega stuffed Oreos, and I realize why I need my wife in those moments.
And just like things to do. You think, oh, you got all this time to yourself, and it's like, well, what do I do?
What do I do? The answer to that question for me is always golf. But yes, it is.
Yeah.
Again, but that's probably for the best that my wife is there to stop me from golfing all the time. Um,
Yeah. But when the weather's bad, you're just stuck inside or you're stuck inside for the night, and it's like,
oh
well,
yes, yeah. Then you really don't have anything to do with yourself. So that's right. That's right. But
yeah,
you're
and
doing
there's
well. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah. And one last thing I was gonna say is like there are all these shows and like documentaries that I know Mackenzie wouldn't care about that I want to watch, or I think, I need to watch that sometime. But then when I get in those moments, I'm like, "Ugh, I really don't want to watch that. I don't know what it is. It's just
It's
strange.
a very strange feeling. Yes, because there's a lot of those things I have as well. There's a lot of things that we as men, I think that um we care about and we'd like to watch that our wives just have zero interest in. I'm big on, obviously I want to watch like history documentaries. That's a big thing for me, and obviously Anna has zero interest in that. But even there's other TV shows, like the new Fallout TV show, by the way, which is
Hmm.
something that I find to be I wouldn't say it's the most morally pleasing show of all time, but it's also not the worst show I've seen recently. It's clearer than anything HBO's putting out. I'll say that. But
Yeah.
very entertaining, and that's something I know my wife would definitely never want to watch. And I've been able to watch
Mhm.
it this week. So because people have been talking about it, hadn't watched it before. I tried that one. I also tried Shogun, which is somebody's talked a lot about that. And feudal Japan is what it's talking about. But
Really?
I can't stand subtitles though. People say it's
Oh.
so good. They say the show is so good, but the whole thing is just subtitles, and I just can't do
Well, you
it.
need to get with the program because I've seen that the overwhelming majority of millennials now watch shows and everything on TV with subtitles. So,
I can't do it. I can't do it. It's one thing. It's one thing if like they're speaking in like broken English and they add subtitles, or it's
yeah.
like I'm trying to keep the TV quiet and I need subtitles. I just can't do a show where it's in like a whole other language and they're translating
Yeah.
over. I can't get into it. I just can't. I'm reading the whole
Yeah.
time. It's very quick. It's very. I can't do it. I can't do it.
Yeah. Well,
So
regardless, it's not good for man to be alone.
it is. This is very true. This is very true. There's a reason why God created our partners in this way, and we need them desperately. Um,
Absolutely.
and
So
and in
thinking
thinking
about
what
it,
God
what
has
God's
done, and
done.
there you go, and thinking
Yeah.
what God's done. Why don't we talk about what God has done in our lives, where we've seen God in our lives? Michael, why don't you go ahead and begin this week?
Yeah. So I had an exciting conversation after service Sunday. Um, Kaylee, who worships with us, decided she wanted to be a Christian, and I believe she's listening. So she said she likes listening to the podcast. So congratulations, Kaylee. She made the decision to put Christ on in baptism, and just seeing her heart and her courage and her decision to follow Jesus, it was really cool to see all that. And so that's where I've seen God this week.
Wonderful thing. Congratulations, Kaylee, on your becoming a Christian, joining the family in this way, and know that you have a family far and wide now because you have joined the family that is
Mm.
the body of Christ. And all those who are out there who have maybe are new Christians who are listening to this as well, congratulations for joining the family. It is, we talk about it as the most important choice of your life, and it is. It is the most important
Mhm.
choice you ever make in committing your life because every other choice you make has an end date. But and the choice to becoming a Christian that continues on forever. So we congratulate all those
Absolutely.
who have been in that way. As for
What about you,
where,
man?
yeah, but say so as where I've seen God this week is, um, we had somebody recently come down with an illness very quickly, very rapidly, and prayers were given. And the amazing thing I really feel in this congregation, more than many others that I've been involved in, is the amount of prayer warriors we have here. People who, it's not that they're going to show up at your door, not that they're going to do, all these sorts of things, but they're going to pray. And a lot of times we say, hey, we've got these prayer requests that we need to pray for. But very few people actually take the time to actually go through and pray for all those people. And to have that, to have people who believe that God is going to move in prayer, praying, it changes a lot of things because then God moves. Because as
Oh
we
yeah.
know, God hears the prayers of the saints.
Mm.
And as these saints are praying, things happen. And that person was healed very quickly, and were able to get back to right health. But it was more than just seeing that one person have that positive effect. It was the idea that there are people here who are praying with their hearts deeply to their God, believing that He's going to move. And then He does.
Mm.
And that's where I've seen God this week, is in the fact that not only did God move, but God has moved people in their hearts to go to Him with full belief.
Definitely. That's a special place to see him. Speaking
Absolutely.
of God moving, um, we see in the Old Testament, we see a very strange period of time. And we're going to be talking about the book of Judges over the next, I guess, couple of months, really. But I was just thinking about that and how God's people from time to time were oppressed by foreign nations. And really, we read in the book of Judges that it was their own fault. They would act wickedly and serve other gods, and so God would allow other nations to take them over. But when they cried out to God, He was there to help them, and we're going to read about that in just a minute. But the time of the Judges, by way of introduction, is after they had left the land of Egypt, after they had been led by Moses, and then Joshua into the Promised Land. They had conquered the Promised Land, and yet this is before the time of the kings, and so it's kind of in the middle. And there's a particular group YouTube channel called the Money Guy Show, and they call like middle age the messy middle. Well, I kind of think that this will be the messy middle of the Old Testament. The time of the Judges is a dark time, and we're going to read about that. But we're going to read, kind of by way of introduction, Judges 2. Dakota, would you read Judges 2:18 and 19?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting in verse 18, it reads, "Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways."
All right, so we see this pattern, this cycle, and you might have learned about this in Bible school at different points in your life, but they would act wickedly. And really, this all took place after the death of Joshua. Joshua died, and the people were faithful after the elders that were of that generation died, but they didn't raise up leaders. And so when that second generation came up, they acted wickedly, and they went against the Lord. And then this cycle began. And so then the Lord would raise up a judge to deliver them. And yet, when that judge died, they would fall back. So, Dakota, when you think about this time in biblical history, what are some of your thoughts, just generally about it?
Well, if you think back to when they enter, before they enter the land, they make this, there's this reassurance of the law in Deuteronomy. We see this whole thing in Deuteronomy where the law is kind of repeated again. And so that they know, hey, this is the law, and they agree, yes, if we do the law, then we will be blessed. And then they also agree, if we do not do the law, then we will be cursed and we will be
Mm,
under a curse at this point. And they go into the land and they're told to drive out all the peoples from the land. And immediately from the very beginning, they do not do all that God has instructed them to do. They do not drive out all the peoples from the land. And this causes them to have direct contact with people groups who worship other gods, and they fall. They fall prey to this, and they start living apart from God's laws and fall under that curse. And so God righteously judges them, as He always does with His people, and they experience the hardships. But as you point out, God is faithful when they call out to Him. When they
mm,
turn their
mm.
face to Him, when that day comes when they recognize God again as their God, their sovereign God, they cry out to him, and God is faithful, and he raises up a judge to do good for them. But I think it demonstrates the fickle nature of man, that we can continuously get trapped in cycles like this, where when we're at our lowest and bad points, it's very easy for us to look up to God and say, I've got nothing left. Please help me. And then
Mm,
when we're on back on top, it's very easy to say, look at what all I've done,
mm.
and to rest on our laurels to the point where we're back down at the bottom again. And this happens again and again and again and again within the judges, over and over again. But I think the thing more than anything that I get from this section that we're going to read is how faithful God is to a very unfaithful people.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Time and time again, they turn their back on him. And the one thing I would say too is just to be mindful of we're always one generation away
Yeah.
from disaster. And I know that that's probably not the message we want to hear nowadays. I mean, it's crazy how much technology is accelerating generational changes
Yeah.
and differences among the generations. So that's even more so the case. But we should be mindful of how we're raising our children, and that we should do our best to raise them to know God and to love God. And that starts with our example. But that's something to think about. Good thoughts on Judges. Anything else before we go on to what we're reading?
No, just said I would definitely reiterate what you just said, because I do think that's we're seeing a little bit of fruits of that, as I would say, as parenting, the level of parenting I think overall has somewhat decreased in our country. We have started to see a decline in certain moral values, and I'm not going to say it's completely that way, because there's certain amount of more values that have increased in time, but in the fact that there is not so much open racism and things like that. But at the
Well,
same
but then there's
juncture,
also like, go ahead.
uh-huh. No, no, finish your thought.
No, I don't know how much I want to get into it, but you know, the entitlement with the protesters on the college campuses and the mess that all that is. I saw something yesterday that some of the protesters were mad because the colleges were not providing food for these people who were protesting. Basically, they were trespassing on campus, and they were upset that they were not their basic human needs were not cared for by the college campus.
Well,
And
again, but we talk about, I think there's some positive things, right? We've got a
yes,
little less open racism and sexism and things like that. But on the other side of this, again, we're a generation away from losing a lot of things where we're this entitlement has encroached in, other such things encroach in, the fact that there are no moral truths anymore and these kind of ideas. Um, Again, one generation, it is so important. If any generation gets skipped, things
yep,
can go downhill very quickly. And that happened here. It happens throughout the Bible, and it's happened throughout history. There's so many ways in which we can see this, where it just takes one thing that happens, one generation, and everything can slip very quickly.
yep. And that's again us. Let's all be lights to those around
Yeah.
about us, and let us do our best in our sphere of influence. So Dakota, what is it that you've been reading? I think what you've been reading will also dovetail nicely.
Yes, yes. Tends to happen a lot recently and not intentionally. But continuing the reading of The Prodigal Prophet by Tim Keller. I could have read this in like a week because it's so good, but I'm trying to hold off and read it over time because I'm preaching through Jonah, and taking my time through Jonah. So I want to take my time through this book and reading it again because and just about anything Tim Keller writes I could read in a week. Because it's so good, and we know. I mean, I know I'm speaking to Michael here, who knows that completely, because what he writes is so good. But continuing on this theme, um, when we talk about certainly the judge's cycle or our own cycle in our own lives, it's so easy when times are prosperous for us to pat ourselves on the back, get lazy, and allow this level of uh, I've lost the word. Not contentment, but
Complacency.
self-satisfaction, maybe complacency. There it is. This level of complacency. I knew it started with a C, but I'm like, it's not contentment. Complacency. There it is. Hey, but complacency to set in, and for things to quickly go downhill, and it is usually only at the bottom that we can look back up and see the God who we have maybe forgotten in these moments where we've
Mm,
taken care of ourselves, quote unquote. And it's only then that we can truly see God. And Tim Keller talks about this as it regards Jonah, because, of course, Jonah resists God. Jonah resists God. Jonah resists God. And he does all these things to resist God's call. And it is only when he is thrown overboard, sinks into the waves, and this
mm,
fish that God seems to have created for this one purpose of containing Jonah takes him, and it is only at the bottom that Jonah can finally look up and see God. And so Tim Keller says this in talking about this particular passage. He says, "It is only when you reach the very bottom, when everything falls apart, when all your schemes and resources are broken and exhausted, that you are finally open to learning how to completely depend on God. As is often said, you never realize that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. You must lose your life to find your life." And
mm,
obviously, this is important for Jonah. This is important for judges, and this is important for us today. We should try to focus ourselves to the point where we do not have to get to the bottom
mm,
to be able to look up and see God. But praise God that we have such a faithful God, that
mm,
He is always looking out for us. And even when we're at the bottom, when we cry out to Him, He will deliver us.
mm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And just reminds me of the rich fool who had accumulated a lot and he was ready to just eat, drink, and be merry. And I just think about that tendency in our country is just to in our culture to accumulate and to do all these things and to get stuff and really look inward and focus on me. And that's the problem that that man had. He was so focused on himself. Um, we can feel self-sufficient and feel like we've earned this or done this or achieved that. But in reality, we are so much like Jonah. We run away from what God calls us to do. And for now, we're getting away with it. God hasn't intervened in a Jonah-like fashion. But I think this quote from Keller is beautiful, is that you never realize that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have.
Yep.
Um, yeah,
Mm,
let's draw our hearts to that he
absolutely.
is all we really have.
Yeah. And I'll go off one thing you said there. Maybe you haven't had a Jonah moment, but I did have a little bit of a Jonah moment after my motorcycle accident a few years ago, and that's another discussion for another day. Sometimes we don't have it. I was in the belly of a fish, but I was walking with a cane for 2 years. So
Yeah. Well,
it really is.
and I totally get that. And
Yeah.
I haven't had as one's near as dramatic as yours, but
Yeah.
I'm speaking more generally just going through life, the
Yeah.
general
Yeah.
humdrum rut, if you will,
Yeah.
of life. Um, but yeah, you're
But
right.
some
And
but
that would be
sometimes we have to have our Jonah moments, and that's why, frankly, while I would never want to experience that again, that motorcycle accident that I had, um, I praise God for it because it was my Jonah moment. It was my
Mm.
belly of the fish moment, and everything changed because of that moment going forward. So, but
Mm.
anyway, good thoughts. Continuing on, Michael, what have you been reading?
Side note, that might not be a bad thing to dive into one episode, is we just kind
Mm.
of do a yeah. Okay. Anyways, I've been reading Deep and Wide, continuing through by Andy
Yeah.
Stanley. And excited to share this with you guys. Um, he said, knowledge alone makes Christians haughty.
Mm.
Application makes us holy. If you want a church full of biblically educated believers, just teach what the Bible says. If you want to make a difference in your community and possibly the world, give people handles, next steps, and specific applications. Challenge them to do something. Um, one of the things that John Maxwell often says is when you're communicating to people, you need to get them from know how to do now. And
Mm.
this is that challenge, that application step. And this really challenges me because I am a big believer in biblical literacy and like people knowing the Bible. And obviously this whole podcast is kind of about that. But like that only takes us so far.
Right.
We still have to do something with it. And somebody that I have listened to over the last few years is Andrew Itzen. He's a preacher in Madison, Alabama, one of the largest churches of Christ in the country. And something he does in all of his sermons, or most of them, or whatever, is he gives action steps. And I know that Itzen is influenced by Andy Stanley, but I have adopted this, and the reason being is that like people and myself included, we need to know what exactly is the bottom line. What
Mhm.
do I do with this bit of information? And so Stanley here is saying we need to give people handles, give people a next step, uh, specific applications. And so trying to say, hey, what is something that you can do with this sermon this week, or even in this moment as you're listening, and something that can change your week ahead. But the whole philosophical shift that Stanley brings out, I think is would be important. And if you're in church leadership, if you preach every week, I would challenge you to make the effort to give people something very specific to do, that they can put on their to-do list for Monday, or some other time throughout the week. But what he said, their application makes us holy.
I'd agree completely. As somebody who has who preaches regularly, I need to always have application in my sermons. A sermon without application for me is it's an unfinished work because um, it gives information, but without telling people how to use that information, it tends to be useless information.
Yep.
It's kind of one of those things where if you guys have ever experienced this, you've been taught to do something, but until you actually like do it with your hands, you can't
Yeah.
actually, do it. So it's just information until you actually put it into practice. And making something practical, applicable to somebody's life, it needs to be involved in every lesson because otherwise you get that idea of when am I ever going to use this information? What good is this for me in any way, shape, or form? And whenever you're talking about the Bible, for example, we talk about the judges. It can be very easy to, just to say, oh, all these people did all these things, blah, 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 blah. Who cares? There's application that can be involved in everything that happens in every portion of the Bible in some way, shape, or form. And this is no different, right? But without application, it is just information. And it is important to be biblically literate, but biblically literate for what reason?
Yeah.
For righteousness, for holiness, to be able to tell others about, to either grow closer to God or to tell other people about Him. That really has to be at the end of the day. Everything that we do as Christians needs to come down to, am I either growing closer to God or am I benefiting somebody else because of what I know with God or what I'm doing with God, right? It's either a benefit to
Mm.
somebody else or a benefit to my relationship with God. And I think this is fair with even information we can learn about God. And I think this is why sometimes I get even tentative to go deeper into schooling um, for biblical education. Me and Michael both talked about this before because when is academia academia and when is it applicable to ministry? And it's very
Mm.
important to have both of those things. And so I think for all of us, we always need to remember that what we have, in our churches and our Bibles, it has to be able to apply to our lives. And especially if you're in a position where you're, as Michael's already said, preaching, teaching, application must be there. Because if you can't apply the text, then really you have not fully educated the people that you are trying to teach.
Definitely an important point. We certainly hope that what we do here is the benefit to you. And if it is, share it with one of your friends, your family, whoever you know that might benefit from it. We thank you for joining us today on the M&M Discipleship Podcast. Until next time, let's look for God, learn from his word, and live out his teachings. Bye for now.